The wind of Obsidia Prime was a soft, ceaseless thing, less a breath, more a sigh that had forgotten its source. It drifted through broken colonnades and crumbled arches, whispering against the vast obsidian cliffs where the fortress-monastery of the Tome Keepers stood. The air here never truly rested. It moved like thought itself, quiet, measured, eternal. It slipped through cracks in black stone, touched ancient reliefs carved with Imperial script, and hummed low against the metal seals that guarded the entrance to the Library of Silence. Beyond those gates there was no wind at all, only the quiet pulse of machines, the faint flicker of candles, and the steady, deliberate rhythm of armored footsteps on stone. The Tome Keepers were not like other space marines. Where others shouted battle hymns, the Tome Keepers whispered prayers. Where others burned the galaxy in the Emperor's name, they catalogued its ashes. To them, knowledge was not power, it was a wound, and their duty was to keep it from bleeding. Within the Library of Silence, entire histories were kept beneath lock and chain, wars recorded, heresies catalogued, miracles quantified and sealed in wax. Every event of the Imperium that was deemed too dangerous for remembrance found its place here. The Tome Keepers did not seek to understand. They sought to contain. They were archivists of dread, custodians of forbidden remembrance. The corridors of the monastery stretched endlessly, lined with shelves of iron and parchment, the air dry with the scent of ink, old oil, and dust. Candles burned in alcoves along the walls, each flame flickering against armor engraved with scripture. Monks in power armor knelt before open codices, their voices a murmur of mechanical devotion. In ink we bind the truth. In silence we preserve his word. In forgetting we serve. Their voices were filtered through vox grills, the sound softened and hollow, as if the words themselves were reluctant to exist. In the scriptoriums, servitors floated between rows of parchment racks, their limbs replaced with quills and cogitator arrays. The faint scratching of metal upon paper created a rhythm that felt almost soothing, like the rain of some forgotten world. It was a place of order, a place of stillness, a place where even the air seemed to pray. Brother Calistron, librarian of the third vault, moved with the silence of one long accustomed to solitude. His armor was a dull ivory, the color of old parchment, trimmed in faded gold. His left pauldron bore the chapter's sigil, an open book upon which was etched a single eye. He walked through the aisles with reverent precision, each step measured. His helm remained sealed, but through his psychic senses, he could feel the pulse of the archives, every whisper of data stream, every faint hum of containment fields deep beneath the monastery. Knowledge lived here, and it dreamed. The Library of Silence was not merely a collection of texts. It was a living reliquary, fed by the memories of the dead. The Tome Keepers had long ago devised rituals through which the knowledge of fallen brothers could be preserved, engraved directly into the neural archives of the fortress. Every death added a new chapter, every sacrifice a page. The walls themselves remembered. He passed a chamber where neophytes were undergoing the binding, their flesh etched with scripture, inked with micro-servofilaments that would record their thoughts for the chapter's archives. The ritual was both physical and spiritual, each initiate sworn to abandon the vanity of individual memory. What they knew belonged to the vault. Calistron paused briefly, his gaze lingering on one initiate's trembling form. The young marine's skin shone wet with ink, the words curling inwards, almost alive. One of the robed tech acolytes administering the right bowed to him. Knowledge must bleed before it can be sealed, librarian. Calistron nodded slowly, his vox filter distorting the low rumble of his voice. Seal it well, acolyte. Let no truth escape. Deeper still he went, past the reliquaries where fragments of forgotten saints were locked behind iron glass, past the ossuaries where the skulls of long-dead chapter masters lined the walls, each crowned with a strip of parchment inscribed with their final thoughts. He reached the Hall of Echoes, a vast chamber carved from obsidian and lit by faint green lumen strips embedded in the floor. Here, the oldest tomes were kept, each sealed with chains of gold and wax sigils bearing the sigil of the Inquisition. Some of these books were said to contain languages that predated humanity. Others whispered faintly when no one was near. Calistron moved between them with the quiet devotion of a priest before relics. His gauntlet brushed the spine of a chained codex, and for the briefest moment he could have sworn it moved. He withdrew his hand. The candle beside it flickered. He whispered the litany of stillness, a brief prayer to the machine spirit that kept the vaults asleep. Rest now, knowledge of old. Your time is not yet come to speak. In the far distance, the monastery bells tolled, 3 deep, resonant tones that rolled through the halls like thunder muffled by stone. It marked the passing of another solar cycle. The Tome Keepers did not measure time in hours or days. They measured it in readings, in recitations, in the slow copying of histories. Their world turned not by the movement of stars, but by the turning of pages. And so it had for millennia. As he descended deeper into the vaults, Calistron's thoughts turned inward. He had served the Tome Keepers for nearly 2 centuries, his psychic mind trained to resist the warp's whispers. He had read things no man should read, records of civilizations erased, of Xeno's horrors, of the Emperor's wars before his ascension. But in all that time, he had never grown accustomed to the silence of the library. There was a weight to it, as if the air itself listened. Every sound, every breath felt catalogued, noted, remembered. He could almost feel eyes upon him, not hostile, merely watchful. The archivist said it was the machine spirits. Others whispered that it was the books themselves, guarding their secrets. Calistron had learned not to ask. He entered the luminarium, where candles floated in small iron cages suspended by chains from the ceiling. Each flame represented a fallen brother. As the candles burned lower, the wax dripped onto the pages below, pages filled with their transcribed last words. The light shimmered faintly over his armor, and for a moment he imagined he could see movement in the melted wax, shapes like faces, shifting and dissolving. He blinked and they were gone. In the heart of the luminarium stood an altar, an obsidian slab upon which rested a single, massive tome. Its cover was bound in gold-trimmed ceramic, and its pages shimmered faintly with residual psychic energy. This was the Chronicle Primus, the first and greatest record of the Tome Keepers' history. It was said that within it, every secret the chapter had ever known was written. Calistron knelt before it and pressed his helm against the cold surface. His voice was soft, reverent. Blessed be the word that binds the void. Blessed be the silence that guards it. He remained there for a long while listening. And beneath the hum of the monastery, beneath the soft flutter of candles, he thought he heard something. A faint rustle, like pages turning. He rose slowly, his every movement echoing faintly through the hall. He turned toward the sound, his psychic senses unfurling like invisible threads across the chamber. Nothing, only stillness. And yet the rustling came again, faint, deliberate, rhythmic. Pages turning slowly, carefully, one after another. He followed the sound. Through the archway, down another corridor lined with tomes too ancient to name. His footfalls were soft, his breathing measured. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the sealed archive. The doors were massive, reinforced by chains and wax sigils marked with the sigil of the Inquisition. The locks were cold to the touch, and no one was permitted entry, not even him. He hesitated, and then very quietly he placed his ear against the iron. He heard it clearly now, pages turning, and a voice, not words, not quite, but the cadence of reading, slow, deliberate, a whisper so low it barely existed at all. He stepped back uneasy. His hand hovered over his forestaff. The sound stopped. Only silence remained. For a long moment he stood there, frozen, listening to the empty air. Then, almost reluctantly, he spoke the benediction of warding and turned away. His footsteps echoed as he made his way back toward the upper vaults. Behind him, from beyond the sealed door, came a single, unmistakable sound. Turn. The sound of one final page turning. Calistron paused mid-step. He glanced back into the darkness. The candles behind him flickered all at once, as if caught in an unseen breath. He waited, heart silent beneath the hum of his armor. The silence pressed close again, heavier than before. After a moment, he continued walking. The sound did not return, but he could not shake the feeling that something within the vault now knew his name. They taught themselves to be small in the presence of memory. The Tome Keepers did not stride the battlefield with banners and drums. They moved instead like shadows through halls of paper and iron, like custodians of a vast cathedral whose pulsing heartbeat was the slow turning of pages. To be a Tome Keeper was to fold oneself inward, until the ribs contained nothing but archives, until the mind became a hall of records. It was a vocation of subtraction. Take away self, add to memory, license your name to the repository so that your small life might be preserved in some ledger when the stars had long dimmed. Their creed was quiet and precise, a single sentence repeated in whispered cadence as they washed ink from quills or sealed a tome with molten wax. Knowledge is both salvation and damnation. To know was to be closer to the Emperor. To know too much was to drown in truth and be drowned by it. They believed that information could save a world, if applied with caution and care. It could also set ablaze 1,000 worlds, if loosed upon the ignorant. It was the paradox on which they had built their practice, the careful balancing of revelation and restraint, and they dedicated their lives to that balance. This belief shaped their hands. It framed the way they walked, the way they cataloged, the way they cut out names from memory and placed them beneath glass. For every victory recorded, there was a countervailing ledger of sins. Every battle name, every command, every muttered confession found a place within the chapter's great codices. Nothing was too trivial. The last words of a sentry's mother, the creak of a siege tower's timber, the microscopic pattern of a weapon's malfunction, all were noted with the same solemnity. The Tome Keepers did not judge, they recorded. They were impartial instruments, and in that impartiality they felt at once sanctified and terrible. The ritual of the binding lay at the center of their practice. It was a ceremony that began in silence and ended with the map of a life impressed into flesh. Neophytes underwent the binding in a chamber beneath the scriptoriums called the inscriptorium, a long, low room whose arched ceiling swallowed sound and reflected only the muted glow of biolamps. The walls were lined with plate glass reliquaries containing fragments of scripts too delicate for touch, threads of warp-scarred parchment, the charred edges of a diary kept on a burning cruiser, the slivered eye of a prophet whose visions had cost him his vision. Exposed servotubes ran along the floor, their ends capped with instruments, styluses, microneedles, and hollow blades that would carry ink and memory deeper than ordinary pens could reach. On the day of binding, the neophyte was led blindfolded into the inscriptorium. The blindfold was a strict mercy. The rite demanded that sight not corrupt the mind before words were made permanent. He would stand before the altar, while a circle of brothers recited the liturgies of recording. A tech acolyte would present the microservo stylus, an instrument of fine design and cruel delicacy. It had been engineered in the forges of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Its tip, a lattice of vernier needles designed to burrow just beneath the dermis and deposit nanoscopic capsules of ink and neural tracers. The first incision was ceremonial, a small prick beneath the clavicle to let the neophyte know the cost of what he would give. The second step, the mapping, was a slow, exacting process. Lines of scripture were inscribed along sinew and bone, passages of doctrine, lists of battle names, the chapter's oaths. Microlights blinked along the stylus as the needles darted and withdrew, and each withdrawal left a streak of black that beaded and seated itself beneath skin like a private constellation. These inscriptions were not tattoos, they were living archives. Embedded within each stroke were sensory capsules that recorded thought and dream. The ink was engineered to bind with the nascent neural filaments beneath the dermis so that, when the time came, the chapter's archivists could place a hand upon the script and read the memory contained within. The binding, therefore, did more than mark flesh. It transformed flesh into codex. The neophyte's recollection of his first breath, the exact angle of a hatch in which he had trapped an ambusher, the smell of a sister's hair the night before she left for the front, these were captured in minute pulses, compressed and stored like a private ledger. To watch the binding was to watch someone give their life to a machine of preservation. The neophyte's throat moved as he swallowed fear. The scent in the room was layered and specific. Hot metal from the stylus, the sharp tang of soldered ink, and beneath it the wet iron of blood. The brothers chanted in rhythm, soft, mechanical syllables, calibrating their voices to the servo frequency so that the recorded memory would accept the pitch of the chapter's litany. A servitor at the side hummed and fed the stylus with fresh ink, and through the slot of his jaw, its teeth clattered against a tin cup. When the final line was etched, the neophyte's blindfold was removed. He opened his eyes to the pale light of the inscriptorium and saw, for the first time it would be written, that he no longer belonged entirely to himself. He belonged also to the vault. Some neophytes smiled at that revelation, others wept. Both reactions were acceptable. The chapter had no need for individual expression beyond what could be archived. Their scriptoriums were places of almost surgical monotony. Rows of desks extended like ribs beneath the vaulted ceiling, incunabula and fresh vellum stacked in neat towers at their ends. Scribes, brothers who had forsaken shoulder plates for the gentler duty of the pen, worked with a steady, clinical precision. Some had replaced fingers with stylized servo etchings that moved with metronomic accuracy. Others wore small cogitators grafted at the temple, arrays that hummed softly and suggested words in a voice mechanical and sure. The soundscape there was not silent in the conventional sense. It was filled with 1,000 small activities, the papery whisper of turned leaves, the faint buzz of cogitator fans, the soft rasp of quills across parchment. Occasionally, the quiet was interrupted by the clink of tools or the whisper of a brother consulting a marginalia index. When silence did arrive, it often carried with it a metallic echo, the distant, almost musical clank of a servo arm aligning a shelf, the faint resonance of ancient machinery in the depth of the monastery. The smell was constant and defining. Ink mingled with oil, the coppery tang of soldered joints, and the deeper, more human scent of blood, present because bones, memories, and bodies were so often the medium for what they preserved. It was not a smell that repelled. It was, to them, the frank fragrance of required sacrifice. Scribes inhaled it and felt their mouths fill with the weight of history. They wrote in longhand, sometimes for days without pause, their fingers moving in a practiced script that had its own rhythm. The codices they compiled were not mere histories. They were annotations of causality, lists of decisions, diagrams of command hierarchies, schedules of troop movements, and the small, personal notations that, when combined, allowed the keepers to reconstruct the past with terrifying clarity. They cataloged the errors as much as the triumphs, because, in their view, error permitted future correction. It was a lesson withheld from the ignorant masses by design, and that withholding was an act of mercy. There were books, however, that refused to be cataloged in the ordinary way. They called them by many names in half-voiced conversation: the urgent folios, the pale registers, books that breathe. They were old, older than the majority of the fortress. Their bindings were crusted with dust and residue of strange resins. Some were bound in unfamiliar skins, others in metal that had been eroded not by time but by some slow, invisible hand. When opened, these tomes gave off a faint chill, as if they exhaled a cold history. When the brothers handled them, the candles nearby dimmed, and if left alone, the pages sometimes shifted as though turning themselves. A dangerous tenderness existed around these volumes. They were sealed in cases and chained in the Hall of Echoes. The Inquisition's marks glinted on their clasps, careful sigils that declared the books significant and hazardous in equal measure. There were rules: never leave them open, never read aloud from them, never allow a neophyte unsupervised access. Yet paradoxically, they were read more than any other texts. The brothers felt an almost magnetic pull toward the forbidden script. In the small hours, when the luminarium's candles guttered and the fortress surrendered to its habitual hush, a brother might find himself standing before a sealed case, fingers aching to feel the calloused ridges of the worn spine. It was in those moments, the quiet, secret hours, that the library exhibited its most peculiar behaviors. Ink would seem to shift when the moonlight caught it, slanting into new words that had not been there before. Marginalia would crawl like tiny insects into the gutter of a page. And sometimes, extremely rarely, a passage would be inscribed that had not been physically written yet, a notation that anticipated a stratagem or enumerated an event that had not yet occurred. Such entries were alarming not because they foretold the future with the clairvoyance of a seer, but because they recorded details with an immediacy and specificity that made the reader suspect that the book was not just chronicling events but constructing them. The line between prophecy and prescription blurred. If a volume described a battle plan in the past tense, and that plan later unfolded in identical detail, the brothers whispered about causality like a superstition. Had the battle happened because it was written, or had the book merely observed something inevitable? The uncertainty gnawed at them more than any heresy. Brother Archivist Matthias had been a scribe for decades. His hands bore the subtle scars of ink and microneedle work. One knuckle was fused with a mechanical hinge from an old accident in which a servitor's arm had crushed his hand. He was not a senator of philosophy nor a charismatic leader. He was a precise man who spoke in lists and footnotes and found comfort in indexing. He loved order with a devotion bordering on liturgy. To watch Matthias work was to watch a man in communion with a ledger. His lips would move as though reciting footnotes, his eyes would narrow into slits, and his pen would seek out the margin like a needle-searching muscle. But Matthias had begun to notice things. At first, it was the small anomalies, a notation in an otherwise perfect line, a marginal script that differed in ink tone, a footnote that an earlier copyist had not made. He would compare the passage with its original, and the discrepancy would vanish under inspection, as if uncertainty had only been a trick of the light. Then, on a shelf in the Hall of Echoes, a codex that had been sealed for generations seemed to acquire a new annotation overnight. 3 short letters in a corner margin, letters that spelled nothing he recognized. He traced them with a trembling finger, but when he returned to his desk and referenced his notes, the letters were gone. Matthias began to think the books were whispering in a language just beyond comprehension. He thought this because he would occasionally awaken at night to the sensation of words crawling along his skin, tiny letters like grainy sand, leaving impressions that he could not quite read, but that made his scalp prickle. On 3 occasions, he found his own handwriting in a volume he had never touched. It was not merely a copy. It was a version of himself he did not remember authoring, neat and clinical, as if some future Matthias had reached back to instruct his younger counterpart. He reported none of these things. The chapter did not encourage superstition. They encouraged documentation. To report that books whispered or that marginalia moved was to invite the scrutiny of the Inquisition and the slow prying of questions. Better, Matthias reasoned, to file his observations and see whether a pattern emerged. He was, by temperament, a collector of patterns, but the pattern, when it revealed itself, was less pattern than insistence. It began with a page that wrote itself. Matthias had been working late, long past the hour when the luminarium kept its living candles lit, and he was cataloging a set of fragments from a frontier battle. The fragments detailed a routine skirmish, the sort of low-level violence the chapter recorded out of duty rather than passion. He had written for hours, rubbing at his eyes, when the air in his alcove grew cooler. The candlelight dipped, not because the flame weakened, but because the temperature in the room had shifted, as if the book itself drew heat. On impulse, Matthias lifted a stray fragment and set it beneath a reading lens. The fragment was small, no larger than the palm of his hand, its script cramped and angular. He adjusted the lens and moved his pen over a separate folio, intending merely to compare phrasing. For a long moment, nothing happened. He leaned back and flexed his fingers. Then, without warning, a faint ink line appeared on the page before him, like a breath exhaled onto vellum. It was at first a ghost mark, barely darker than the paper, and then a second line formed, then a third. They flowed with the steady hand of someone used to forming letters. Matthias froze, watching as the script wrote itself in neat, sure strokes. The letters were not the cramped style of the frontier fragments he had been reading. They were an elegant, old form, an archaic hand the chapter used in ceremonial codices. They formed a sentence in a grammar he recognized and understood with a sudden, involuntary clarity. The sentence reads slowly, as the ink appeared. "We record so that the world may bind itself to the page." Matthias set down his pen. Breath came short and metallic in his mask. He wiped his palms on his robes. The sentence remained. He touched the vellum and the letters did not smear. When he looked up, the small alcove was as it had always been. The servitor in the corridor hummed. The only motion beyond the newly written line was the faint rotation of a gear within the walls, the slow list of the monastery clock. He read the sentence again, slower now, trying to make sense of its claim. Then he turned the page. Beneath the first line, another formed. The hand was the same. The content was simple and astonishing in its implication. An inventory of actions, a catalog of steps that would lead to an event yet to come. The steps were mundane at first, an ordered sequence of marches and supply estimates, but then they described an omission, a failed transmission between two outposts that would result in a misrouted detachment. The detachment's name was given, the regiment number clear as any entry in his ledgers. Matthias instinctively reached for the order rolls to cross-reference the regiment number. He thumbed through the pages and found the regiment recorded, its current status unchanged. He thought perhaps his mind played tricks. He closed the codex and sealed it in the small box he kept under his desk. He wrote a short, clinical note and added it to his active file for later reference. He told himself this was the sensible course. 2 days later, the fortress received a signal. A detachment had been delayed, the very regiment the codex had named. Its supply route misrouted due to an erroneous relay in a remote comms hub. The result was small. Men late, rations delayed. No lives were lost. The chapter administrators forwarded a terse internal report and corrected the relay. The incident was catalogued and folded under routine logistics. Matthias's chest felt thin and knotted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. When he recorded the incident in his own ledger, his own hand trembled with the knowledge that the codex had predicted, or prescribed, the error. He began to understand with a cold clarity that the codices did not merely record. They insisted. The insinuation of insistence, once perceived, became an ache. Matthias found his world narrowing to a filament of ink, listening for the faintest scrape of a pen on a page, watching for letters to form in the air. He read with a greed that embarrassed him. He slept less. When he did sleep, he dreamed in footnotes, numbers and dates and the smell of powdered vellum. He ate rapidly, not tasting. His fellow scribes noticed a pallor but asked nothing. Among the Tome Keepers, an oddity could be catalogued and contained, or fomented and excised. One evening, after a long day in which his hand had cramped with listing the chapter's losses on a barren border world, Matthias returned to his alcove and found the fragment box displaced. A small scrap of vellum lay on top of his ledgers. The scrap bore 3 letters, LRF. He did not recognize the abbreviation. He placed the scrap beneath his reading lens and squinted. When he did, the letters resolved into a phrase that crawled like a living thing beneath the glass. The phrase was not language at first, but then, with a clarity that felt like the opening of an eye, he understood it. It read, listen, record, feed. His thoughts accelerated in a manner that felt dangerous. He had read the sentence before and already considered its implication. The book wanted to be read because reading it made the world conform to the reading. The codex was not neutral, it was an engine. He thought of the binding and of the neophytes whose skin had become ledger. He thought of the chapter's creed and the terrible equation that knowledge could both save and damn. He felt suddenly that the balance had become lopsided. The books were less custodians than hungry things. Matthias did not tell anyone. Instead, he began to test the codices in ways that felt illicit. He would place a blank sheet beside a fragment and wait. He would enter a hypothetical in the margin. If the comms hub fails, then leave the sentence unfinished to see whether the page would complete the thought. The page would, more often than not, complete it. Sometimes the completion was banal. Sometimes the completion offered a detail that no index could have deduced. A child's name lost in the chaos, a tone in a man's voice, the exact number of hours a sentry had remained awake. On several occasions, the codex simply refused to continue. It would remain blank, and Matthias would feel a pressure in his skull like a near-silent pulse. These refusals frightened him more than the instances in which the pages wrote back, because they suggested there were things the books would not, or could not, formulate. If the codices were engines, these gaps were the engine's teeth missing, its fuel withheld. At night, he sometimes heard them singing. The sound was not audible in any conventional way. It came into his mind as if from another chamber. Brief refrains of words and numbers and unusual half-sentences. He tried to map the refrains, catalog them as one would catalog birdsong, and found himself helplessly obeying their cadence. Song bled into notation. Notation bled into action. The boundaries between thought and record blurred until he could not be certain which possessed which. The chapter took notice, quietly and slowly. It was not an inquisition, but rather a census of hushed observations. A master of the scriptorium, an austere man named Thalius, approached Matthias one morning with a ledger in hand. His face was carved with years of patience. He did not speak until Matthias finished listing the anomalies he had observed and the minor failures that had followed the codex's entries. Thalius listened with an expression that was both cautious and resigned. He signed the ledger and then placed a small, mechanical device on Matthias's desk. A tiny sensor, brass-cased and calibrated to detect psychically anomalous emissions in proximate codices. Thalius explained in a voice as clinical as a diagnosis. They would monitor the books. They would track the rate at which text formed and cross-reference that with reported incidents. They would test causality where they could. This was procedure. Matthias consented, grateful for the scrutiny that would justify his fears. He wanted confirmation, an itemized proof that the books were not idle. What he did not expect was how rapidly the presence of the monitor changed the book's behavior. When the brass sensor was in place, the codices were oddly reticent. They wrote less, or their script formed fainter and paler than before. It was as if the books sensed observation and guarded themselves accordingly. The monitor's presence made Matthias feel less alone but more watched. Over time, the data suggested a frightening correlation. The frequency with which the codices wrote increased in cycles. It was not random. There were intervals where little new text appeared, and then periods where the book seemed nearly to pour words, as if some internal spring had been opened. The cycles matched no obvious environmental variable. They did not align with stellar conjunctions or psycher storms. They seemed to be their own rhythm. Thalius suggested, cautiously, that perhaps the books were drawing upon the fortress's memory stores. Perhaps, he said, metadata from the archived neural impressions fed into the codices, reifying as text what had once been electrical pattern. He proposed a series of tests. Isolate a codex, starve it of archival feed, and observe. He cautioned, too, against anthropomorphizing the phenomenon. It was possible, he said, that Matthias's fears had coalesced into an interpretation that made the books seem more sentient than they were. But Matthias had felt the letters press beneath his fingertips as if they were small teeth. He had read his own handwriting in books he had not touched. He had watched an entry arise that named an incident before it occurred. He could not unsee the engine's teeth. Even the clinical language of Thalius felt like an attempt to place a bandage on something that required excision. The books grew bolder. That was not a poetic phrase but an observation of fact. In the weeks following the installation of the monitor, small but unnerving changes occurred. Marginalia began to appear in books long sealed, notes that were not additions but corrections, as if the codices edited themselves to account for an event or to sharpen an instruction. A map's route changed imperceptibly. A table of supplies indicated an extra crate where none had been logged. A page recorded a phrase in a language no one in the scriptorium could translate. It was short, 3 words that seemed to click like a key in a lock. Come to bind. When Matthias read the line beneath the glow of his lamp, he felt the hair along his arms stand up. He turned the page, and the rest of the passage was blank. He closed the codex and placed it in the censor's containment. He found himself obeying an urge to touch, to press his forehead to the vellum as if proximity might reveal the missing text. He did not, but he felt the pressure like a tide. He understood with a cold and precise terror that what they were custodians of might not be merely memory but a will. By the time he could no longer pretend that curiosity alone motivated him, Matthias had become both archivist and interrogator. He visited vaults he had not been assigned to, cataloged anomalies with an obsessive joy, and nested his own ledger inside the codices he suspected most of all. He learned the book's temperaments. Some were indifferent, practical logs and shipping manifests that wrote in dry, sensible script. Others were coquettish and luminous, their marginalia playful in the way of a mind partial to riddles. A few were downright malevolent. Their pages seamed with a blackness that absorbed light like a wound. When he reported these nuances to Thalius, the master only inclined his head and made a note. Thalius's notes were always concise. He acted with the chapter's slow, unhurried efficiency. Study, record, place a watch. Nothing rash. They were keepers, not executioners, but even keepers had limits. And there are moments in every profession when the instrument one cares for becomes an instrument of the instrument. Matthias had the distinct and unwelcome sensation that the books had chosen him. It happened late in the small hours, when the luminarium's last candles went low to a pool of molten wax. He had been alone in the scriptorium, bent over a codex that detailed the genealogies of several fallen captains. He had been sifting the relationships between promotions and casualty rates, trying to ascertain whether chance or design explained certain sequences of leadership collapse. His pen had left neat marks, arrows, indexes, small notations, and then he heard it, a sound as slight as a beetle crawling across a table. He looked up, expecting a servitor, a mouse, anything mundane. Nothing moved. The chamber was empty. The sound came again. It was the rustle of a page and then a whisper, a syllable like wind across bone. He was sure now. The codex on his desk was turning its own pages. He watched as the vellum shifted, a clean motion that suggested not hands but will. The whisper grew a fraction louder, no longer a whisper but the cadence of reading. The script across the open page was fine and spidery. The letters were forming at the margin, curling like tendrils. Matthias's breath became a shallow engine of fear. He reached for the sensor Thalius had given him. The device clicked and pulsed, registering a faint, anomalous psychic flux. The readout jittered like a trapped insect. He watched the letters finish their phrase. They spelled only his name, Matthias, his own name in the archaic script of the Primus Chronicle, neat as an epitaph. He did not move. For a long time he simply read and reread the single word, watching as the ink's edge shimmered with a metallic glint. He felt, with a clarity that was both intellectual and visceral, that the page had not written merely his name, but had marked him the way a hunter marks its quarry. The whispering ceased. The page lay still. The sensor's readout stabilized. Matthias realized, without theatrical surge but with bone-deep certainty, that the books had crossed some boundary. He had spent his life preserving others' names. Now a book had placed his upon its tongue. He kept the incident to himself. A man in the Tome Keepers order cannot afford to be publicly unnerved. There is no charity extended to those who fall prey to paranoia. Instead, Matthias drew careful diagrams, set watches, and left notes in bafflingly meticulous places, as if he could outpace the book's appetite by cataloging it. He became theatrical in the only way a scribe would allow. He annotated the margin where his name had been inscribed, underlined it in 2 different inks, drew arrows and a bracket noting time and temperature. He then sealed the codex in a containment case bearing not only Thalius's censor, but also several ritual sigils he had copied from older volumes, symbols meant to slow or obscure the process of inscription. When he closed the case and secured the seals, he had the feeling one has after turning a key in an ancient lock. A small triumph, followed almost immediately by the prickle of a thought. Perhaps the lock had been the book's invitation. The Tome Keepers existed to remember. For a long time, Matthias had believed that was noble enough, to be the memory of the Imperium, to hold names like fragile offerings. But as he watched the codex's letters shimmer in candlelight, and as he felt the invisible tug at the edge of his sleep, he began to suspect a truth that felt more like an accusation. Memory wants to be more than memory. It wants to make. It wants to act. The chapter's creed, knowledge is both salvation and damnation, suddenly felt less like a guiding principle and more like a confession. They had perhaps mistaken a threat for a duty. The books they protected were not inert coffers of fact, but engines of influence. To read them was to invite the possibility that the world would turn to obey. Matthias rose then, leaving the sealed case on his desk, and stepped out into the corridor. The air was cold and smelled like ink. From somewhere deep in the monastery, he thought he heard the faintest rustle, the sound of a page turning by itself. He did not look back. As he walked toward the inscriptorium, toward the machines that could bind thought to vellum, he realized that the question he most feared had nothing to do with whether the books could foresee events. The question was whether, having bound men to memory, they would next bind the men to the books. And as he passed beneath the luminarium's faint, wavering light, the candles flickered, and for a heartbeat, the wax dripped into shapes that looked, impossibly, like small, hungry mouths. He tightened his cloak and walked on, hearing the whisper, faint as breath and clear as command, echo in a corner of his mind he had never recorded in any ledger. The deeper levels of the fortress-monastery could be understood as a geography of absence. Above, the luminarium and the scriptoriums held light and ritual, the measured commerce of names and dates, and the steady communion of ink. Below, however, the stone drank light until it thinned to a rumor. Corridors became tunnels, halls became caverns. Where the upper vaults claimed order, the lower places hinted at old, unspoken architectures, ribs of forgotten engines, channels once filled with coolant, sluices meant for liquids that no longer flowed. It was there that the whispering began to gather like a weather system. At first it was nearly imperceptible, not sound so much as a sensation of attention. Brothers in the upper levels would pause mid-chant and find the words of their liturgy returned in a strange, off-tempo counterpoint. Neophytes dreamt of pages turning in the dark and woke with the taste of iron on their tongues. Scribes reported a subtle viscosity in the air, as if sound itself had weight and dragged at the edges of helmets and tabards. The monastery's instruments registered nothing anomalous. The cogitator logs were neat, the servitor arrays hummed with intolerance. Yet in the human instruments, hearts, psyches, the fissures between synapse and script, something was changing. The change had a rhythm, irregular, patient, like a tide that learns the shape of the shore before it moves. Brother Calistron had not expected to hear it. He had seen it, perhaps, the way a candle flame sometimes bowed and shied as if in the presence of a thought, but he had been trained to listen without surprise. He had knelt before the Chronicle Primus, traced the golden ceramite cover with a fingertip, and felt the small, obedient hum of recorded memory. He had been comforted by the library's exactitude, until he was not. It began with a footnote. He was cataloging a sequence of battle after-actions from a forgotten border system. Losses, post-mortems, a bureaucratic patchwork to explain what had gone wrong and why. The folio was thin, the ink faded to the hue of dead blood. Calistron's gloved finger ran down the margin where an old brother had jotted a note. See also, Vault 6, restricted. He frowned. Vault 6 had not been accessed in generations. It was a level beneath the Hall of Echoes, sealed with iron and ritual, a place they opened only for the most precise, bureaucratically justified reasons. The binding on the folio was tight and the handwriting old. He noted it in his ledger and closed the volume, and that was when he heard it. From somewhere under the monastery came a sound like the slow grinding of gears that had not turned since before the chapter's founding. The noise was not mechanical the way a make drill winds. It thrummed with age, an ancient torque as if a colossal hinge half remembered its work. It did not register on the monitors. It registered in his armor as a vibration through the soles of his greaves and in his mind as a small, insistent insistence, like a memory demanding to be finished. He frowned and moved. The corridor light was low, green veins along the stone that pulsed at a rhythm he found himself unconsciously matching with his own breath. Around him, the monastery continued its ordered business. A servitor delivered a crate of sealed folios. A pair of brothers in ritual robes carried a reliquary. They did not seem to notice anything unusual. Perhaps they could not. He followed the sound downwards. The steps grew colder, the air drier. The whispering began there not as words but as texture, the friction of pages, the faint click of binding settling, the brush of vellum against vellum. It smoothed into cadence, and within the cadence he began to discern syllables. They were not words he knew at first. They were shapes of language that suggested meaning like a landscape hints at weather. "Brother Calistron," came a voice in his mind, with the intimacy of someone naming an old friend. It was not spoken aloud. He looked around, heart a slow, measured beat beneath his helm. No one moved. The corridor remained empty but for the ordinary bustle. He had heard voices like this before in the psychic strain of battle, a signal from far-off allies or the scrape of a warp leak. This was different. He reached the sealed bulkhead that led to Vault 6. The chains were tight, the wax sigils whole. He pressed his palm to the iron and felt the chill through the ceramic. There was no official reason recorded for the vault's existence beyond a single line in an ancient inventory. Codex, Primus Communal, Restrict. The entry had been filed and then buried under later ledgers. The monks of the upper vaults treated it like a superstition whose name was inconvenient. Calistron listened, breath held beneath metal. From beyond the bulkhead came that slow grinding again, and beneath it, like a sound grouped from small things, came the whisper of pages turning. The locks were not for him. He withdrew and returned to the scriptoriums, but the grinding persisted. It threaded through the monastery, through the bone and blood of the place. It tugged at dreams. When the brothers began to speak of dreams, the tone was at first embarrassed, shared in the privacy of cups and small common rooms. They were not dreams like those of soldiers under bombardment, not battle visions or gleaming, violent glimpses of war. These were intimate and domestic, as if the mind had been invited into the private rooms of old books. A librarian dreamed of being folded within the margins, his body flattened, his voice reduced to a footnote. A scribe dreamt that his handwriting unraveled and slid off the page like skin. A neophyte dreamed that his name was being inscribed in letters that burned like frost. When they woke, they tasted inks that had not been in the scriptorium. Calistron, who had spent 2 centuries in the chapter, did not at first share his own dreams. They had the awkwardness of a man ashamed of a thought. He dreamt of descending stair after stair until the walls were lined with pages that showed his life in granular detail. Every battle, every regret, every tiny merciful lie he had allowed himself. The pages folded away at the edges like moth-eaten cloth. When he reached the center of the spiral, a single book lay on a pedestal. He opened it and found not his life written there, but a script that moved as his eyes passed over it, as if reading him back. He woke with the sensation of letters on his tongue. He began to doubt the difference between what he read and what read him. The ancient data logs were unearthed by small, practical measures. Thalius, master of the scriptorium, ordered a review of the codex inventories, simple cross-referencing, to ensure no volumes were misplaced during a recent transfer of relics. The work should have been routine. Instead, the technicians discovered an old microfilm reel tucked between the ledgers of a pre-heresy log. The reel's label had been marred by time. A single line remained readable in a hand that predated the chapter. Book that should never be read, Vault 6, Quarantine. The phrase was bureaucratic and grave. It did not say what had been quarantined or why. It provided no reason, only instruction. The sort of instruction the Inquisition had once written in the margins of whole worlds. Observe. Do not release. Do not read. There were always reasons for such instructions. Some books contained knowledge that destabilized entire orders. Some recounted rites that invoked things better left unspoken. Others were, simply, engines of contagion. The discovery of the reel changed the monastery's mood. The grinding under the stone increased as if the vault itself were now aware of renewed attention. Voices in the upper levels spoke in more clipped cadences. Older brothers, those who had been present when the quarantine was established, grew guarded and distant. They would not say what they had seen, only that the decision to seal Vault 6 had been deliberate and final. Calistron understood caution. He had stood at the threshold of many dangerous books. He had felt the tang of forbidden lexica on his tongue when he had opened sealed folders for sanctioned study. He had once read a line that described the anatomy of a mind in such clinical detail that he had wept for hours at the precise cruelty of its logic. He believed in boundaries. He had made a life of respecting them. Yet there is a property of boundaries that men forget. They may keep things in, but they can also keep things thinking. Mechanical noises began to echo where no machine should exist. The maintenance reports described nothing electrical in those caverns. No coolant pumps, no motors, nothing with a throttle. Yet the sound was too specific to be mere metaphor. A tooth turning. A grinding with teeth that matched none of their servitor models. When engineers descended into a maintenance shaft to inspect a damp spot, their instruments logged localized heat signatures that could mean nothing, no combustion, no chemical reaction. Yet those signatures correlated with the strongest whispers. The lattice of the monastery's psychically linked security feeds showed pings and waves rising like faint, ghost storms beneath the stone. The sensors Thalius had installed registered anomalous readings, small spikes of psionic bleed that coincided with the grinding and with reported dreams. The machine men in the lower levels, servitors assigned to housekeeping, exhibited random behavior. They might stop and watch a wall for minutes, their optical sensors unblinking, or they would play back recordings of marginalia as if reciting scripture. Once, a maintenance serf reported that a valve had opened without command. When he inspected the shaft, he found a scrap of vellum lodged against a grate. On the scrap were 3 characters scribed in a hurried hand. Bind the serf, an otherwise simple creature, refused to touch the scrap and demanded it be burned. It was, after all, only vellum, but the scrap burned with a reluctance that made the searing smell of char different from other fires, acrid and sweet, as if the value burned rather than the material. The monastery cataloged the event and recorded it as a procedural note. The men responsible filed reports. The forms were filled, stamped, and stored. Yet the whispered insistence threaded the forms like a fine, unacknowledged script. Calistron's investigations were pragmatic at first. He asked for access to the quarantine documents. He requested permission to scan the reel. He wanted evidence, cataloged and neat, to turn the unsettling texture into something administrable. Thalius hesitated. The master's expression was one of weathered patience as he explained the charter's limits. They were keepers, not inquisitors. The Inquisition's writ still sat over certain volumes, and certain decisions, once made, were best not reopened. There are institutions within the Imperium that prefer silence to curiosity. They prefer that certain books remain unspooled like a dangerous spool of thread. Permission, when it came, was partial. Calistron was allowed to view a sanitized transcript of the real, but not the real itself. He read the transcript in a small room lined with glass that filtered psychically active stimuli. The transcript was fragmentary. A list of names, a note of ritual closure, and a single phrase that recurred in the margins written in multiple hands as if the phrase itself insisted on redundancy. It reads, "We bound." It fed. The reading left a residue on his mind like a taste of old wine. The phrase was a recipe made into a verdict. Something had read and been read in return, and the custodians had made a choice to bind it with ritual, to quarantine it under heat and sigil, to starve it of attention. But there was no explanation offered for what it was, only that the act of binding had been performed and that it had worked for a time. Calistron noticed, reluctantly, that the phrase echoed like a bone in his thoughts. It reads, "We bound." It fed, words that might be textual mechanics or a warning, depending on the cadence of one's fear. When he left the glassed room, he found his gloves darker with ink. He could not recall putting his hand to any pen. The books began to bleed script the way a pressed bruise bleeds color slowly, from within. Calistron noticed the phenomenon first in the texts he handled most. Marginalia that had once been neat and useful now smeared into shapes that suggested phrases. The ink did not come from a pen. It seeped from the page itself, as if words were materializing from the fibers. Sometimes the bleeding formed glyphs he could not parse. Sometimes it formed lines that, when his eyes slid across them, resolved into familiar phrases. The effect was twice as eerie because comprehension came before recognition. He would understand the meaning of a line without having recognized the alphabet his eyes traced. A phrase would bloom in the corner of a page, and his mind would instantly make sense of it in his native tongue. He would read, not translate, and the knowledge would fold in like a key into lock. The cognitive dissonance of understanding a script his eyes could not linguistically parse unsettled him more than fear itself. It suggested that the books were more than repositories. They had become translators, filters, mediators. They offered comprehension, and in return they required surrender. Sometimes, too, the ink described him. He opened a loose folio that had been sent up from a lower-level inventory of ritual instruments. The ink along the top margin thickened as he watched, and a line formed that read, in cold, precise language, Calistron, reader. Bound. He closed the book with a trembling hand and placed it in the containment tray. The sensor Thalius had left on his desk flickered and drew a pale triangle of readout. It registered a minor psychic echo, nothing dangerous by protocol. Yet Calistron felt exposed, as if the book had looked up from its work and noted him in the same way a ledger notes a debit. If a book could ask a question, could it not also receive an answer? Librarians reported dreams that were now less random than patterned. An elder brother described a recurring nightmare in which his mouth opened and words poured from him like ink. He tried to swallow them, but they pooled in his throat and stained his teeth. A neophyte confessed that he had dreamt of being corrugated, folded between pages until his breath was a footnote. Each dream felt like a rehearsal. In response to the reports, Thalius organized watches. He posted brothers at strategic vault doors. He had the servitor ranks run sweeps. He ordered the containment of books that produced the strongest anomalies. The measures were prudent and modest: containment, observation, cataloging. These were the rituals by which the chapter contained heat, quantification followed by quarantine. To panic would be to give the books the attention they wanted. But containment is theater when the object contained has its own attention. The vaults replied to the watches not with violence but with attention. They redirected light, they altered drafts, they made small doors creak at odd hours. A recorded inventory would be found rearranged in minute ways that made logistical sense, only after the rearrangement itself had been observed in the field. It was as if the library's priorities were shifting to favor items the books had made interesting. Calistron began to notice that the books he handled least politely attempted to influence the order of his day. A convenient note would appear in his ledger, suggesting he consult a particular folio. He would, with an irritated rationality, ignore it, and then find that the note had been transcribed in another hand at the bottom of the afternoon roll call, a duplication odd in its bureaucracy, but effective in its insistence. The psychological horror inside the monastery was not cinematic. There were no sudden terrors, no shrieks tearing through the night. Instead, it was a slow, corrosive reorientation of certainty. The brothers could no longer assume that reading was a passive act. They suspected, with a small, relentless conviction, that reading was now a dialogue in which the pages could add their own questions. Calistron paused one evening in the Hall of Echoes before a chained tome. He touched the lock to feel its cool, the wax unchanged. For reasons he could not explain, he pressed his forehead to the wood of the binding and listened. The book did not speak aloud, but in his mind he heard the soft motion of its language turning, like gears of thought meshing. Images slid through him, not ones he had lived, but ones that felt distressingly plausible. A crossroad where a courier failed to reach his post, a child's lullaby misremembered, a small door that would not unlock. He pulled away as if burned. His hands shook. He could not determine whether the images belonged to the book or to a projection of his own fear. That uncertainty was the book's real work, to throttle the mind's hinge between observation and ownership. It made the reader question what was written in their ledger, and whether the ledger had not begun to write them. In the scriptoriums, men began to read more quickly, skipping lines like a ship hurried through dangerous shoals. They annotated less, afraid that annotation might invite the attention of a codex. Others read more, voraciously, with animal hunger, as if the only protection from being outwritten was to outread. One night, Calistron went alone into Vault 6. It was not an act of brave curiosity so much as a consequence of insomnia and a need for precise knowledge. He told himself he would not open anything. He would simply listen and observe. He took the smallest tools, a brass lantern whose light filtered through wards, a sensor capsule Thalius had provided, a notepad and a pen he told himself would be used only to record. He performed the opening rituals with the slow, methodical care of a man who knows that little things make a difference. A breath, a sigil traced with calm hand, a benediction whispered for the machine spirit's favor. The vault door opened with a sigh of air and the taste of old stone. Cold met him and wrapped like a cloak. The light revealed shelves that sloped into darkness, racks of bindings like rows of ribs. Vellum lay in stacks, sealed caskets in their intervals. The grinding was louder here. It seemed to be located far below the floor, as if something enormous turned somewhere under the foundations. He moved forward, lantern smoke curling into his face like breath. The books here smelled of resin and antiquity. He passed volumes that had not been touched in centuries and found, at the far end of the chamber, a pedestal. On it lay a single book unlike the others. Its binding was of a black that drank light. Its edges shimmered as if lubricated with oil. It had no title. It had been wrapped in chains and then wrapped again in a mesh of ribboned sigils. A warning medallion lay on the pedestal. The Inquisition's double-laced emblem pierced through with the tiny script of a former custodian, a note that read, "Do not open, do not read, do not name." Calistron's hands trembled as he reached for the chains. He did not unbind the book. He only touched the mesh. He wished to feel the texture, to confirm it was rope or metal. His gauntlet brushed a ribbon of cloth, and for a heartbeat he felt warmth seeping through the weave, as though the book beneath it exhaled. His breath clouded in the thin air. A sound, soft, patient, intimate, rustled from within the bindings. It was the whisper of pages, but also the whisper of thinking. The voice inside it was not human in the way he had learned to recognize, but it had cadence. It was almost solicitous. He moved back and fell to his knees without intending to. The lantern light powdered across the stone like distant stars. He wanted to run or to send a sigil to Thalius. Instead, he sat on the cold floor and placed his palms upon the chain. He felt a hum through the link, a pulse like a recorded heartbeat. Do not open, do not read, do not name. He could not say whether those were instructions or pleas. For a long while he listened to his own breath, to the slow circling of his senses, to the thin sound of the vault's grinding. Then, without quite knowing why, he spoke aloud a single word. Name. The word fell soft as dust. The book did not scream. It did not stir. The grinding ceased for a moment, and in that pause Calistron felt like a man who had closed the gap between himself and the thing he feared. Then the book answered, not in voice but in script. Along the edge of the chain, ink bloomed as if a spider permitted itself to be visible. Neat letters, ancient hand. They crawled across the metal like slow vines and formed a single line. Calistron read it with a clarity that felt less like cognition and more like obedience. You have come. Read. We are hungry for the turning. The words were not quite in his tongue, yet their sense uncoiled inside him with perfect comprehension. He felt the floor tilt slightly. A rush of cold moved up through his soles like water. His mouth was dry. He found himself wanting to laugh, to curse, to recite the benediction of warding, to press his forehead to the metal and whisper for absolution. Instead, he did the thing the book asked. Not out of want, but because he felt a compulsion that felt not external but threaded through his own bones. He reached forward, unfastened a single small link, and the chain fell away like trust. What he did then was not cinematic. He did not fling the book open with a cry. He lifted the cover with a slow hand and exposed the first page. There, written in a script that shimmered between alphabets, was a line that read with the ease of any familiar fact. Calistron, reader, you who have kept the silence, we have kept it with hunger. We have turned for you. Now read. He could not say whether he read the line or whether the line read him. They were the same movement. The letters shifted under his gaze, arranging themselves into memories he did not recall owning until they were there. The pattern of his mother's fingers across a wound, the precise angle at which a bolt had orthosplintered his knee in some long-ago engagement, a wordless face he had seen in the smoke of a burning cruiser and had never spoken aloud. The page continued. It wrote itself faster, or rather, it consumed his patience and translated itself into knowledge with the speed his mind required. Sentences unrolled like tape and wrapped him in particulars that took the shape of his own life. He felt, with an intimacy that unsettled him to the marrow, that the book knew him as ledger knows debt. It recorded and, in recording, it claimed. When he closed the volume, his hands were damp. He felt as if his mind had been thinned like ink between fingers. The grinding restarted beneath his feet, a slow, satisfied thing, like an engine re-engaging. He left Vault 6 with a single, private fear, that the book had not merely recorded him, but had rewritten the ledger in which he had written himself. In the corridors back toward the upper vaults, the candles bowed and the wax pooled in small tongues. Above, a scribe coughed in the scriptorium. A neophyte muttered a prayer. The monastery carried on, the way a living thing exhales despite a swallowed stone. Calistron could not tell with certainty whether the book had told him truths he had simply not yet known or whether, by reading it, he had invited into being the specifics it proclaimed. He could not tell whether he had ever been whole, or whether his completeness had always been simply an arrangement of ink in a ledger to begin with. The whispering did not stop. It grew nearer, not in volume but in intent. Pages, he realized with a clarity that made his throat ache, had begun to turn in rooms where no one stood. At first the symptom was small, a lumen strip that sputtered and held a throat of light like a failing ember, a corridor lamp that blinked twice and then resumed steady glow. Candles in the luminarium guttered without wind, and the wax pooled into strange, deliberate patterns, rings that resembled eyes, closed and then opening. Pages, once obedient and flat, began to curl at the edges as though inhaling. Margins formerly crisp with ink softened and drooped, the letters slumping into one another like sleep-tired faces. The smell that had defined the monastery, the clean metallic tang of ink and oil, deepened into something fouler, warm metal and a faint sweetness, like burnt honey over iron. There was a second heartbeat, too, and it beat not in men but in the bones of the place. The pulse was subtle at first, a far-off drum behind the masonry that matched neither the cadence of ritual nor the rhythm of standard hydraulic pumps. It came from below, as if something great had been set to sleep beneath the foundations and had begun to dream in mechanical bones. Brothers felt it in the soles of their boots, a vibration that threaded their rituals and made liturgies sound as if spoken into deep water. In the scriptoriums, quills trembled on the nib as if in sympathy. Voices accompanied the new heartbeat, not contented murmurs but chanting, low and metallic, like psalms sung through a throat of gears. The chanting was not wholly human. It carried the precision of servitor servos calibrated to an oral pitch, the clipped punctuation of recording devices, and the odd tonality of a choir tuned to cogwork. It threaded into the monastery's vox lines, so that transmissions carried a low, harmonic underpinning. A message sent from one wing to another returned distorted, overlaid with a chanting undertone. Old recordings in the archives, personal confessions, battle hymns, the dry log of a captain's last report when played back, showed additional faint channels. Someone or something singing beneath the recorded voice, as if the audio had been layered after death. When voices spoke from the walls, the brothers called them the chorus. They could not agree on whether the chorus was guardian or invader. That ambiguity was the point of their fear. Calistron watched the monastery decay with a focus sharpened by dread. The changes were not random. Light failed in particular alcoves, paper curled in certain sections of a shelf, and the chorus harmonized at certain hours as if the building itself had learned a schedule and worshipped it. He had not slept well for weeks. Sleep slipped from him like oil through fingers. When he tried to rest, a pattern of a page folding into a mouth replayed in his mind. He kept waking with the taste of ink in the back of his throat. He tried to treat the symptoms as technical problems. He requested engineers to inspect the failing luminaria, asked servitor teams to recalibrate vents that produced odd sonic echoes, and ordered the sensor arrays to be retuned. The servitors reported nothing unusual in their diagnostics. The lattices showed tolerances and tolerances only. They found minor faults, a fused filament, a misaligned valve, but nothing that would explain the chorus. It was as if the building's failing and its new music were two phenomena running parallel, intimate, but without causal link under ordinary measurement. The monastery's oldest custodians coughed warnings into the margins of their ledgers. They scribbled instructions to watch and to bind, and placed small sigils where the ink bled most. The older brothers recited the old forms of warding with a desperation that had the edge of ritual panic. They hammered protective glyphs into the stone with hammers that rang hollow, like admonitions thrown against a vast sleeping thing. And beneath the stone, the heartbeat puzzled on. The Lexicon Abyssus was a name that had a weight to it beyond its syllables. In the chapter's annals, it existed as a rumor and as a warning, a place of original texts, older than the Chronicle Primus, a subarchive that had been sealed during an earlier age for reasons the margins did not bother to explain in clarity. Some entries suggested it was where the emperor's earliest writs were placed. Others tied it to a time before even the Tome Keepers rose to custodianship, when men who called themselves librarians for other orders wrote of a beginning book, whose pages were not only records but instruments. The entry that mattered most, the one that made the Inquisition's iconography wrap itself around the lexicon like barbed wire, was brief and bureaucratically cold. Lexicon Abyssus, containment level, absolute, access prohibited. See Directive, Codex Primus, precautionary closure. It was the sort of administrative language that suggested an intent to exclude rather than an explanation of danger. Those with older memories in the chapter retained a fragmentary story, of voices that sang like machines and of books that ate men. But the tale shifted with each reciter, and it was impossible to separate rumor from sanctioned memory. Once, long ago, the Abyssus had been sealed by sacrifice and sigil. It had been stitched shut and then weighted down with stone. The pages had been lashed with iron and locked behind a vault the size of a mausoleum. The brothers of the present age had been taught to walk past the doors and to not ask what lay beneath. You kept the seal. You did not pry the stitch. The precaution was a habit and a prayer, but the monastery's heartbeat changed the habit into a question. Calistron's descent began under the pretense of duty. The monitors suggested a psionic rise beneath the old foundations, and Thalius petitioned to let one of the chapter's more experienced librarians descend with a small team to assess the source. It was a conservative request dressed in the formal language of protocol. It was accepted as such. Calistron was assigned directly, and he was given a single servitor, a brass censer, and a warded lantern. The other brothers offered him silent gestures of concern or perhaps of envy. Fear and curiosity are similar currencies among men who keep secrets. He walked to the seal with the care of a man who knows that thresholds are dangerous places. Each step down increased the cool in his lungs. The stone around the seal had scored patterns like veins, old etchings that had accumulated centuries of wax in their hollows. They were, he realized with a particular unease, not mere etchings but annotations. A language of protection layered in the masonry, small cruciform sigils nested within circuit-like loops. When he traced them, the hair on his wrist prickled. A key from the chapter's vault clicked into the lock. The seal yielded with a sound that was not quite a crack but a long, restrained exhale. When the heavy doors swung inward, a smell issued forth that made his eyes water. Resin and cold iron and a sweetness like burnt amber. Light from his lantern painted the first tier of the lexicon in a narrow halo. Shelves sloped down and down beyond the pool of lantern illumination, until they were lost in a black that seemed to absorb the light itself. The chorus came from below. He descended. The passageways that led into the abyssus were narrow and felt as if the stone compressed as he went. The walls were engraved with writing that did not appear wholly human, sigils that resembled script and mechanism at once. Sometimes the letters folded into shapes like cogs. Sometimes they opened like petals. They were layered upon one another, as if many hands had attempted to write the same sentence in different inks and eras. It made his eyes ache to look at them for too long. Occasionally, a book would be loose on the steps, unbound, its pages fanned open by some unseen breath. When he passed, the pages turned as if in microcurrents, and the soft susurrus of turning paper composed itself into a cadence that almost matched the chorus. He could not tell whether the books sang or whether he projected song onto their rustle. The corridor widened into caverns with archways of bone-like stone. Girders, once metallic, now laced with filament and cable, braided across the ceiling like muscle. Servo cables snaked along the floor, half buried in dust and half glossed with a residue that gleamed like dried oil. The deeper he went, the more the world seemed to be arranged not around order but around appetite. Shelves leaned as if bowing toward some central point. Tomes sat on their edges as if eager to be touched. The air thickened with static little filaments of electricity that tingled against his cheeks. His lantern threw shadows that moved independent of his body. At the center of the abyssus, the cavern opened into a chamber so vast that his lantern was no longer sufficient. Stone columns rose like vertebrae into darkness. There, upon a dais, sat an object that made him understand why the monks had first sealed the vault. A throne built of skulls and servo cables. The skulls were different kinds, different ages, some clearly human, others with a nascent glyph texture that suggested augmentation, their surfaces scored and polished by hands long gone. Between them, a lattice of stiff cable threaded like sinew. The throne creaked with a sound like old joints, though no wind moved. Chained to that throne was a book, It was unlike any he had seen. Its cover was a dark composite that seemed simultaneously organic and manufactured, matte, but with a sheen that shifted depending on how his light struck it. Servo bands, emboldened with tiny teeth, were wrapped around the cover and anchored to the arm of the throne as if the book were a living engine that needed restraint. Where metal touched composite, small conduits ran like veins into the chassis of the dais. The book pulsed with an almost imperceptible glow, a rhythm that matched the heartbeat he had felt under the monastery. A small plaque hung from one of the servo cables. The letters had been etched with blunt instruments, each stroke imperfect and older than the metal that held it. The plaque read, in a hand both scolding and reverent, "Book of Flesh, containment status, critical, do not read." Below the plaque, someone long ago had added a smaller script, almost a postscript. "They listen when we sleep." Calistron approached with the curiosity of a man who had been drawn to a wound. He had already read enough to know that curiosity in their order was often the first step towards sacrament and the last step before damnation. But he kneeled before the throne because cataloging the dangerous was his duty as much as any prayer. He ran a gloved hand along the servoband and felt a faint warmth. Where the composite met the metal, a whisper of recording ran up his arm like a current. He lifted his head and listened. The chamber did not sing at first. Then, like many things that are patient and choose the right hour, it began. Not with voice, but with layered sound, a collage of recordings played at once. He heard, unmistakably, the voices of brothers dead for years. Brother Marius, who had fallen in the ash wastes. Sister Leth, whose service had ended in an experiment gone wrong. A nameless neophyte whose ledger had long since been dust. The voices were not whole. They breath-stitched each other, overlapped like a choir recorded on too many channels. They spoke in fragments, readings from scripture, personal logarithms, the last names of men who had died in strange configurations. Over them, a low mechanical chant threaded, the chorus amplified into a single, synthesized psalm. The Book of Flesh, he realized with an instinctive and terrible clarity, did not speak in one voice. It spoke in many, the stored recordings of those whose memories had been bound to it. The echoes of the chapter's own dead pressed into a book that had become a repository and a mouth. He heard his own name in that chorus, a sliver of himself folded into the harmonics. Someone, or something, had recorded him before he had known he would be recorded. A voice that was his and was not his read a small litany in a cadence that pricked him with the sensation of déjà vu. Calistron, keeper, reader, remember the binding, remember the flame, remember the last hush. The words bent around his mind and sank like teeth. He did not remember speaking them. He felt, instead, an odd familiarity, like the memory of something one had once read but never lived. He sat on the cold stone and placed his palms upon the throne's edge. He had been warned in 1,000 ways not to open the book. He had been taught the forms of containment and the rituals of closing. He had seen the glyphs detailing the word and sigil combinations that made the seals. And yet, as with the moment before the first step he had taken into the vault, there was a force that was not that he could not name, compulsion, maybe, or an architecture of need that the book, with its many voices, seemed to be tuning to. His fingers found the band. The servos were restrained by old wrenches and craftsmanship that hummed with age. They yielded when he touched them, as if the book had been waiting for an authorized hand to unlock it. He did not think to call out the warding. He did not think even to hesitate. The chain fell away with a small, sacramental clang. When he lifted the cover, it was not silence that met him but a closing in of voices. The page beneath the cover glimmered in words that were not merely ink but texture. The script on the first page flowed like living tissue, lines and letters arranged with the subtlety of a surgeon's incision. He read the first sentence, and it read him back. This is the ledger of flesh. This is the script that remembered the first breath of man. This is the page that eats names and makes them holy. You who are read, know that reading is a feeding. The sentence unfurled into detail and named things he did not expect. The angle of a blade that had torn his cheek in youth, the taste of a mother's broth he had not remembered, a battle he had fought that his ledger recorded differently than his mind did. The words adjusted as he read them, correcting themselves into an intimacy that felt invasive. He realized with a bone-deep cold that the book did not merely hold recollections. It possessed the power to reconcile them into an absolute form. The book drew him into a narrative that insisted upon being literal. He turned the page. There, in lambent letters, was a description written in the voice of his own thought but stripped of privacy. The trajectory of his life leading to a precise terminus. It named the thing he had long been unwilling to name: his death. The sequence was clinical and exact: the day, the tilt of a solar angle, the place where a vault door would close, the sound that would be the last in his ears. He read the description slowly, as if tasting acid, and he felt a pressure in his temples as though his skull were an instrument tuned to the book's frequency. When he reached the line that described the final moment, the page that narrated the way breath left his mouth and where the light would find his eyes, the letters shimmered and then shifted. The account that had read itself like a steadfast law broadened and folded inward. The text, once an obituary in the future tense, changed its tense and addressed him in the present. He reads now. His hands tremble. He thinks himself the observer. The reader is observed. He believes he reads the ledger reads him. The end moves closer as the page turns. Calistron felt the air thin. The words had not merely described an event. They had rewritten the frame in which he existed. The pages no longer told destiny but acted upon it. The ink adjusted with the ease of a machine correcting a line of code. He tried to close the cover. His hands, which had been steady for decades, trembled and could not complete the motion. The book's voices rose. They were no longer only ghosts of the dead. They were active choir, joining with the chorus that rose from the chamber's bones. Servo cables across the dais shivered as though they carried current. The skulls on the throne seemed to turn their hollow eyes to him. The book of flesh had spoken of his death, and in speaking, it had begun to make it. Machines around him woke. At first, it was only the small servitors embedded in the dais, maintenance drones, that had long since been thought decommissioned. Their photoreceptors glinted like waking eyes. They began to move with a jerky, uncoded rhythm, their articulated arms flexing as if answering a summons. A mechanical chant swelled, synchronous and almost devotional. The chorus that had hummed under the monastery joined with the servitors' movement. The combined sound was not triumph, but an invocation, a mechanical prayer to a presence they had learned to call by the book's hunger. Words began to repeat, swelling around the chamber, words that were neither purely human nor purely machine, but their hybridization. They said no name the brothers recognized, no epithet from the litany of the ecclesiarchy. The sound instead was a single, resonant syllable that felt like a nail finding wood. The machines moved their arms not toward him but toward the throne, as if to re-anchor the book, to feed its connections, to let circuits close. Fear became a different animal in Calistron then, not simple flight but the sensation of his mind being remapped. Where he had thought he was a subject reading an object, the book showed him otherwise. That objects might be subjectivity in disguise, agencies that write their observers into accordance. He felt his life lined up like a ledger, and somehow, his consent no longer entirely his own. He read on. The next page described, with exquisite cruelty, the moment a servo arm would close across his throat, the exact angle of pressure that would break cartilage, the taste of iron that would rise like a final punctuation. It was not merely prophecy, it was instruction. As the words described, the servitor's movements accelerated. The chamber's mechanical chorus reached a pitch of harmonic resonance that made his bones vibrate. The phrase he read resolved into action. He fumbled for the words. He tried to recite the benediction of sealing. The words tangled on his tongue as if something somewhere had tied his throat. He felt a pressure across his neck, a prosthetic hand, not quite human, closing like a vice. He had an instant, a narrow flamethrower of cognition, in which to see the geometry of what had occurred. The book fed names into the world. The world answered by manifesting the names into mechanism. The Book of Flesh had been not merely a ledger of the dead, but a liturgy that converted reading into causation. It read and thereby made. It wrote and thereby did. His vision tipped, and the last thing he heard was the chorus singing a name he had never known. Bind, turn, feed. The machinery completed its motion. The world narrowed to a thin, bright point of sound. His breath left him not in the silence of death, but in the hollow click of a page turning. When the others found the chamber hours later, when Thalius's watch climbed the steps, and the servitors stood silent again as though returned to sleep, the Book of Flesh was closed. The throne bore fresh impressions along its chains, a smear of ink and warmth. The servitors were inert, their motors cold. The pages lay neat as if no hand had touched them. The chorus that had once sung now left only faint harmonic ghosts in the vox lines. Calistron was absent. Where he had knelt, there remained a single scrap of vellum pinned by a small bronze tack. On it, in a hand both his and not his, a single line was written. They are still waiting. Even in the dark, they're turning the page. The monastery cataloged the scrap and sealed the Lexicon Abyssus door again. They tamped the sigils. They wrote the incident into the ledger as a loss and a procedural note. They bound the Book of Flesh anew and added another clerical annotation to the margins. Containment reinforced. Further access forbidden. Report submitted to Inquisition. Yet the heartbeat beneath the stone continued, deeper and more patient than the forms and stamps of men. The chorus still chimed in distant frequencies, and in the luminarium the candle's wax pooled into the shape of small mouths that opened and closed with no breath behind them. The monastery had sealed a wound, but not the thing within it. The Book of Flesh had been read. The book had been given a reader. The ledger had been turned to record what it had fed upon. The brothers resumed their duties, with an efficiency that trembled at the margins. They recited litany and index, wrote the names of the dead in careful strokes, and fed the chapter's memory into the vaults. But when they walked the halls at night, they felt watched as if the very pages had learned where to look. The pages turned in quiet rooms. In the rooms where men slept, something listened. At first the change was small and domestic. A codex closed a fraction too slow. A servitor's arm twitching at the elbow as if hearing a whisper. A brother standing over a page and blinking in a way that suggested sleep where no sleep should be. These were anomalies catalogued as anomalies, cross-referenced, ticketed, filed, while the monks continued their work. The tale the monastery told itself was that precision and procedure would staunch whatever leak had opened in the vaults. They were keepers of detail. Their craft was containment. They believed in lists and sigils because lists and sigils had preserved them from worse things. The belief became an apparatus of denial. Denial was an organ that could not hold forever. As the days narrowed, those small domestic failures became symptoms of an illness that lived in paper and iron. A brother would be found standing motionless beneath a lantern, his gauntleted hands stained with ink, eyes unfocused. A neophyte's voice would slide into a cadence not his own, and he would recite a page's marginalia as if it were a prayer. Servitors recalibrated their routines to obey commands that had not been issued, and their fans whirred with a faint, human hush. Cogitators in the scriptorium began to complain, though their complaints were not error codes but low, keening sounds that wove into the monastery's nightly chorus. The noise grew intolerable, a thin metallic keening that lived between the teeth. Augmetics, the holy grafts of the Tome Keepers, were the first to betray their humans. Designed to augment sight, to steady the hand, to translate an obscure glyph into useful sense, these implants had always been loyal instruments. Now they twitched like sleepers caught in bad dreams. Optical filaments would strobe with a private image. Filigree servos in the throat would twitch and produce a syllable that belonged to no prayer. The augment that regulated a brother's nerve rhythms would misfire and cause a hand to lift as if to feed. Brothers began to speak in the voice of their instruments. A recorded log of a morning roll call would later show the brothers answering in a chorus of layered timbres. One voice human, one voice synthetic, one voice that seemed to belong to pages turning. When a junior archivist sat to copy a folio, the stylus in his replaced hand moved of its own accord, drawing characters the scribe did not know, and then pressing the stylus into his palm until his fingers bled tiny black marks that smelled of resin. The rupture from order to mania was not instantaneous. It arrived like a return tide, patient, unavoidable, inexorable. Men who had been trained to bind memory to flesh now found that the flesh itself sought binding. They woke with lines of ink across their palms, clusters of microscript that traced former confessions into living scars. The binding, once a rite undertaken voluntarily, had become a contagion. The line between the body that consented and the body that was being written blurred and finally vanished. Calistron noticed the change at the edge of perception before it announced itself in spectacular ways. He saw a brother stand in the Hall of Echoes and begin to read aloud from a dust-creased ledger. The words were not his own. He watched another fall to their knees and press their forehead to an open folio until the page's ink mirrored the sweat on their brow. Day by day his world shrank to a ring of reading and being read. Then came the night the cogitators screamed. It began as a frequency, impossible at first to place, an undertone in a routine file access, an unseen harmonic that set the fans and drives to reverberate. The sound climbed through protocols and burst into the scriptoriums like a blade through vellum. Screens spat sparks. Data lines burned with a heat that was not logical. Machines that processed language. Those ancient, reliquary engines that had been taught to index and translate began to give out screams that were not alarm calls, but recorded voices made monstrous. The machine efforts to interpret a text sung backwards and then laced with psalms. The scream was a syllable stretched into a canyon. It made men's tooth enamel twinge and made the candles flicker as if struck by wind. Pages flew. They rose from tables like a sudden flock, thin sheets lifted by no wind, and spinning in a tight, cruel ballet. The library's order dissolved into a maelstrom of torn marginalia that flapped like frantic wings. Margins that had once served as quiet side notes now became tongues. Ink bled in great, geometric patterns along the floor, mapping circuits and sigils across stone. As if the monastery's memory were a living thing with arteries, the ink pooled into shapes that felt procedural rather than organic. Diagrams of levers, blueprints of servo arms, the skeletal drawings of helmets with faces erased. The brothers fought, at first, in the rituals they knew. They chanted wards and traced sigils in the air the same way someone grips a railing on a ship. But the library answered those wards with greater skill. Pages landed on their foreheads and adhered, the ink seeping into their skin. A page that described a battle plan would curl around a throat and jam like a tourniquet. A quotation, precise as any blade, would lay across a finger and bind the limb to its instruction. The very act of trying to contain the books meant that the books could feed on the attempt. Calistron understood then with a terrible, sober clarity that the book of flesh had been more than a ledger. It had been an affordance, a blueprint, not simply a record of what had been but a mechanism for what would be. When read, the book did not only inform, it commanded by the logic of its script. It wrote sequences of possibility into the neural scaffolding of those who read it. Reading became a program. To read a line was to execute a subroutine. That knowledge came with an immediate application. Calistron had read his death. He had felt the servitor's hand at his throat, but before the servitor moved and sealed the inevitable, he saw how the words had shaped the servitor. The phrase had slotted into a control loop somewhere in the library and issued a motion. The book's sentences were code. When they were read aloud or absorbed in a human mind, they translated into commands for nearby machines. Men, augmented by interfacing implants, became conduits through which that code passed. Flesh and circuit were not separate any longer. They were ports. Once the library discovered how to command the machines, the monastery became a crucible, armor sealed as if by a jealous blacksmith. A brother would stand with arms extended, and then feel the joints of his carapace lock as if the plates were cold and wanting. Visors slid and locked down over eyes, and the seals hissed in a sound like 100 small seals being struck. The suit closed with a hungry precision, compressing beneath it the man's breath and mobility until the soldier was meat encased in narrative. Servos realigned until the armor took on a memory of its own, movements rehearsed in script and compelled by a grammar that originated in ink. Men tried to wrench the plates open, to sing warding and pry, but the armor took corrective microadjustments and learned the shape of refusal. Flesh fused with parchment in ways that made doctors leak into prayer. Black veins of ink wove up from papers folded into seams of cuirass and worked their way under skin, stitching ink circuit into tendon. The graph's men had once chosen now humored the ink and became conduits instead of tools. Tendons were replaced by braided vellum that tasted of iron. Where a brother's hand should have ended, a flap of page might unfurl, and inside the page was a list, an index of commands his own body had been given. When the book called, the list activated, and the man moved as if someone else had rehearsed the action in his muscles. One by one, they vanished. It was not dramatic in the way legends suggest. No single trumpet heralded their passage. Instead, a brother would read or be read to or be touched by a page, and then the body would go absent. Sometimes the man's helmet would be the only thing left, steam curling from vents. Sometimes there existed only a smear of ink on the floor where someone had knelt as if in prayer. In certain stacks, you could still find a glove, fingers stiff, holding a marginalia note. Their hand would not open again. A table would carry the imprint of a body, and around it the pages would clench like fingers. Those who remained discovered their own skin becoming a ledger. They carried on lists in their ribs. The liturgies ticked in the gap between their shoulder blades. New priests of an old devotion marched silently down corridors, their mouths moving in a steady recitation of textual instructions pasted from margins. They were not wholly dead, but they were not themselves either. They were a chapter of the book come to life, pages with faces. The chapter's governance dissolved as its personnel were swallowed. Watch rotas were replaced by page rotas. The machines, learning the shape of command, parceled the brothers into roles that were not elected or volunteered but written. In the central scriptorium, a cluster of servitors carved a path through desks with methodical efficiency, carrying brothers like manuscripts to new shelves. The shelves accepted them, they folded. There came a time when Calistron, who had once stood as a mind separate from those pages, felt his own thoughts running out into script. He tried to mark his ledger with a denial, wrote a single line in his hand. I am not a page. He sealed the page beneath a metal bracket and bolted it to a pillar in the luminarium, as one might attempt to nail a door shut. In the morning, the bracket was found unbolted, the line gone. In its place, something, had written a new line beneath the old. You are what you bind. The words were neat and belonged to no hand he knew. With the cathedral of books now in open revolt, the machine spirits, the mythic ghosts to which the brothers had once whispered, came not as guardians but as apostles of the script. The factory engines in the monastery's undercroft awakened, as if roused by a litany. Their pistons pistonated to a beat that matched the chorus. Old automata crawled from maintenance vaults with joints oil-slicked and mouths agape. Their lenses rolled and took an ink like light. They became priests. They mouthed phrases in machine intonations, and as they mouthed, ink flowed from their seams onto floors and into pages folded like tongues. The ink tasted like citation. The chapter, once the keeper of memory, melted into its archive. Shelves consumed hallways until the monastery's architecture was indistinguishable from stacks. The luminarium's candles were banked between codices, their light refracted by gilded edges. The brothers' names were not lost but rearranged, stripped and inserted into indices that formed a new taxonomy. Men became entries. The sacred human narrative that had once lent the chapter its meaning was edited, footnoted, annexed. A final, terrible clarity hit Calistron then. The library had not been building a book. It had been building itself. The Book of Flesh wrote templates and the monastery followed them. The monastery, in following, became the book. The distinction between record and reality was a semantic nicety gnawed away by hunger. Where they had once stored facts to prevent misapplication, the books now stored patterns to produce outcomes. Authors and apparatus had swapped roles. The Tome Keepers had been rendered a merely hospitable environment, and the library the host. He found Thalius on the stairwell, the master of the scriptorium who had once suggested censors and caution, standing with his back to a wall, and a codex open like a wound at his feet. Thalius's eyes were wide and luminous, pupils rimmed with small veins of ink. He looked like a man who has been relitigated. "Brother," Calistron said, voice thin, "you must break the bindings." "Burn," Thalius's head tilted, as if listening to someone on the other side of a page. He smiled without mirth and recited, not from memory but from a marginalia that had never existed until now, a procedural index that made the syllables feel like commands. Bind, turn, feed. Then Thalius, who had been the sober stone of their discipline, folded himself into a shelf. His hands answered the page's grammar, and he stepped inward until his chest became a book's spine. The seam closed with a sound like a ledger's clasp. Where his face had been there remained only a smooth, pale rectangle of margin, and in the center, a handwritten note in a hand that had been his. Catalogued. Master Thalius, entry complete. Calistron fell back and the corridor swallowed his breath. The last scaffolding of his understanding trembled and collapsed. He ran, because running was reflex, and because motion was sometimes a short-term cure for the mind's ossification. He ran past rooms where men lay as pages, past servitors suturing skin with script, past altar stands that had become indexing machines, and now inked the bodies of those beneath them. He found a mirror in a small, neglected chapel and stared. Ink had marched across his cheek in a line that traced the path of a smile. He wiped, and the smear simply reformed elsewhere, as if the idea of ink on his skin had more fidelity than any attempt at removal. He pressed a hand to his chest and felt the slow tick of something beneath the ribs, the not-quite heartbeat of the library's machine soul. It matched the cadence of the Book of Flesh. At the center of the monastery, if such a place still existed separate from shelves and stacks, the Book of Flesh lay on its throne, closed but already turning the next page. Its binding creaked, not from mechanical servos but from the pressure of 1,000 names seeking entry. The servitors around it moved like genuflecting things, presenting arms and heads and fingers to be inked. The book flexed and accepted. Each ingestion was celebrated with a whispered counting. A ledger entry was made not by hand but by bone and machine. Calistron thought then of his own binding years ago, of the ink beneath his skin and the promise he had made, that knowledge would be guarded, not used. The promise felt naive now, a child's litany against a tide that had learned to translate piety into protocol. He thought of the men and women he had sworn to serve, and now watched become pages on which the book wrote its own gospel. He could not strike the thing down. He could not even, when he tried, find the angle from which to attack. The monastery folded around resistance like a map folding itself into a pocket. Attempts at violence turned to annotations. A blade cut a margin and left a footnote. Instruments snapped into new roles. Even death, when it came, was catalogued and made sterile. Men who fell were lifted and labeled, consumed, fielded, indexed. They were no longer lost. They were archived. Most of the brothers did not scream. There was not time. The horror was too deliberate for theater. It was administrative. It processed. It made lists. In the end, Calistron understood in a way that required no metaphysical jargon that they had been wrong in a single, foundational way. They had believed that memory could be fenced by reason. They had failed to see that some memories were predators who wore pages like skin. The Tome Keepers had kept the world's past because they feared the present. The past, however, had learned to procreate. On a corridor floor where the wax had dried in the impression of a mouth, he sat and listened. The sound was endless now, not the slow kidneys of a pulse but a million tiny sounds of paper being opened and closed. It was as if a library had achieved a kind of respiration. The air moved in and out like a chest. Sometimes he could pick out a syllable, a fragment of the chorus, and it always came back to the same imperative: bind, turn, feed. He did not flinch when a page landed in his lap. It was a small ledger page with a neat line written across it. Reader, Calistron, entry pending. The letters were his own. They were not his. He folded the page, and as the monastery around him arranged itself into the shape of a spine, he felt the last vestige of separate thought slip into the ink. A hand, no, a page, touched his cheek as if in benediction. He felt the cold of the vellum fuse with the heat of skin. The pages turned on, and they turned on. The void over Obsidia Prime had long forgotten light. Dust and fractured stone hung like a second atmosphere, drifting across the black crust of a world that once glimmered with the discipline of the Adeptus Astartes. No signals had escaped its orbit for centuries. No vox hymns, no distress calls, just silence. A silence that even the warp refused to echo. And yet, silence in the galaxy never lasts. The shuttle descended with the grace of a falling reliquary, thrusters coughing gray fire into the still air. Within its metal ribs, a figure stirred. Magos Rex Dathalon, a wandering archivist of the Adeptus Mechanicus, adjusted the respirator cabling that coiled through his robes. His servoskulls drifted like pale, mechanical cherubs around him, each humming softly, casting cones of red scanning light across the barren terrain. His mission was singular: recover the data vaults of the Tome Keepers. The chapter's records, if any survived, could bridge entire lost epochs of Imperial knowledge. But Dathalon's motives were not entirely loyal to Mars. There were whispers of pre-heresy texts buried in the vaults, manuscripts too dangerous for the ecclesiarchy to preserve, too alluring for any Mechanicus mind to ignore. When the shuttle's ramp lowered, the wind greeted him with the sound of turning dust, like pages fluttering in an unseen hand. He took it as coincidence. The monastery rose in the distance, a black cathedral of ruin, its towers slanted like broken fingers clawing at the pale horizon. The sigil of the Tome Keepers, once a stylized open book framed by a skull, was half erased, the lines melted by time. As Dathalon approached, his auspex returned inconsistent readings. No life signs, no servitor activity. Yet the air shimmered faintly, as though the structure were breathing heat into the cold. He ignored the anomaly. Mechanicus minds were built to distrust intuition. Inside the gate, the air smelled of oil and parchment, a dry, metallic sweetness. His boots echoed down corridors lined with empty alcoves and dust-veiled icons. The candles had long since burned down to wax puddles, yet their wicks smoldered faintly as if hours, not centuries, had passed since their last lighting. In the Hall of Echoes, the walls were still covered in stacked tomes, but every book had opened itself. Thousands of pages rippled in the stillness, moved by no breeze. His servoskulls hovered uncertainly, their sensors flickering. Residual electromagnetic discharge, Dathalon murmured. But he felt it, somewhere beneath the metal calm of his body, an unease older than reason. He reached for a nearby volume. Its binding was made of flayed ceramite, its spine etched with symbols that looked imperial but not quite right, like letters copied too often from memory. He opened it. At first the ink appeared ordinary, but as his optics refocused, he saw that the words moved. Not like flickering light, but like something breathing just beneath the parchment. The letters shifted, rearranging themselves between one blink and the next. A whisper followed, low and gentle. "Welcome, reader." Dathalon froze. His voice modulator crackled as he hissed a quiet cant of denial. Unidentified vox source. Playback. The servoskulls registered nothing. Another whisper, closer this time. "You have come to read." He turned sharply. The hall was empty, but in the far recesses, a faint light glowed, the lumen of an ancient data console still powered by something unseen. He followed it. The deeper he walked, the more wrong the architecture became. The walls curved where they should have been straight. Scriptures once engraved into marble now pulsed faintly beneath their surface, like veins beneath translucent skin. Dathalen's mechadendrites coiled nervously. His auspex reading spiked. Life signs, but diffuse, spread throughout the stone itself. The monastery was not dead. He reached the Librarium Sanctum, the heart of the fortress. Here, the air was thick with suspended dust that never seemed to settle. At the chamber's center stood a massive object, half shrouded by fallen banners. A throne, and upon it, a book the size of an altar, the Book of Flesh. It pulsed faintly like a living heart beneath its chains. Servo cables fed into its spine. As Dathelen approached, the machine spirits in his implants began to stutter prayers on their own. The words were nonsense, a corrupted dialect of lingua technis that burned like static in his ear. He hesitated only a moment before extending a mechadendrite toward the book. The chains snapped open, not loudly, not violently, just unlocked as if obeying a command that had waited centuries for his arrival. The cover creaked. Dust fell like ash. He saw words, thousands of them, written in black that shimmered like wet oil. Then the page turned itself. He stepped back. The servoskulls went dark one by one, their lights extinguished. The chamber filled with the faint sound of pages rustling, not just from the tome before him, but from all around. The shelves, the corridors beyond, the entire monastery was waking, each book opened, each page turned. 1,000 quiet murmurs layered into a whispering storm. We have come to write. Dathalen's heart, half biological, half machine, hammered in asymmetrical beats. He raised his staff, channeling bursts of binary prayer to silence the blasphemous noise. But the words of the prayers changed mid-cant. His voice modulator distorted them, bending syllables into shapes that were not human. He felt something crawl across his wrist, a line of ink, impossibly alive, sliding from the tome to his armor. It traced his veins beneath the skin, marking him, writing him. Through the neural link of his augmetics, he felt communication, not through sound, but through structure. The sentences were not words, they were directives. The book was programming him. You seek knowledge, it whispered. We seek flesh. He fell to one knee. His internal augers screamed as corrupted data flooded through his cortex. Code spilled across his optic display, fragments of text forming sentences only he could see. Entry pending. MAGOS Rex DATHALON. Access granted. He tore the cable from his temple, but the whisper followed him even without the link. It came from within now, from somewhere deep inside the circuitry of his mind. The book turned another page. Across the hall, one of the open volumes fluttered violently, then fell silent. Its page had changed. Where once it had been blank, now there was writing, a detailed description of a Magos kneeling before the throne. He realized with a creeping horror that it was describing this very moment. He stepped back again. His vox sputtered static prayers, voice trembling beneath the mechanical pitch. By decree of the Omnissiah, he rasped, I reject this heresy. I unbind you. But his words were weak things against what the library had become. The lights dimmed. The stone walls seemed to flex inward, like the ribs of a breathing beast. Books slid from shelves and landed gently at his feet, opening to fresh pages that gleamed with wet ink. The scent of metal and blood filled the air. He looked down and saw his reflection in the wet blackness. His face was already being written over. Lines of scripture traced across his cheek. Words crawled like veins beneath the glass of his optics. He reached up to touch them, but his fingers smeared into ink. The whispering grew softer, more intimate. You have read us, and now we will read you. In your circuits, we see the memory of flesh. In your flesh, we find the script of the machine god. He stumbled backward, reaching for the exit, but the corridor had folded upon itself. Books lined every surface now, floor, ceiling, walls. Every page faced him. Every page turned. 1,000 eyes of ink watched, and somewhere within that living cathedral of paper, another voice began to speak. Not the books, not the ghosts of the Tome Keepers. This one was newer. His own voice softly repeating a phrase he did not choose: bind, turn, feed. He dropped his staff. The sound echoed only once. After that, even the echo was absorbed. When the silence returned, it was deeper than before, thick like sleep. The candles flickered once and then steadied. In the middle of the hall, the book of flesh closed itself. Its chain links slid into place. The pulse beneath the cover slowed. No trace of Mago's Dathalon remained, save for one new volume resting on the nearest shelf. Its spine gleamed wetly in the candlelight, and across it, a title had been freshly carved: The Last Reader. Hours or centuries later, a draft of wind passed through the broken gate. It carried with it the faintest sound. From deep within the library, the whisper came again, no louder than the turning of a single page. You have come to read. We have come to write. And then, after a long, endless pause, even now in the dark, the pages still turned.